With Taskless today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the novelist Pierre Boulle, a French novelist who wrote a number of quite successful novels. The Planet of the Apes probably being the better known of them, which has spawned, I think, over a dozen makes and remakes and so on, beginning. The first, I think, coverage of this was in the late 1960s, where Charlton Heston played the lead role in the movie called The Planet of the Apes, and again many remakes, including recent ones up to the present day. Now, he also wrote a number of other novels that did quite well. The one that probably did next to The Planet of the Apes, or Monkey Planet as he called it in his novel, was The Bridge on the River Kwai, which was a story about the British soldiers and the local natives being prisoners of the Japanese, being to build a railway that went from Malaya, or Malaysia as it's called today, from Malaya up to through Burma and into the border with India. So the Japanese was part of the Japanese invasion plan to, at the time in the 1940s, to invade India and Burma and so on. So this railway went for many hundreds of kilometres. Supposedly, depending on whose numbers you look at, the conditions were so harsh and brutal in the building of the railway, and the brutality of the Japanese and the Korean guards they used, that somewhere in the region of 120,000 people died. Many of those, or the majority of those, were actually the local natives, but somewhere between 100 and 120,000 people were supposedly died in the building of that railway, which, by the way, still exists today. So I just wonder if it ever would have been built if not for that Japanese effort. Nonetheless, now the novelist Pierre Boulle was an engineer, and a French engineer, and he was working around Indochina, which was a French colony at the time. This is like in the 1930s, and he also worked in the rubber and various other plantations around Malaya as well. He apparently couldn't speak English, or hardly any, so I don't know how he was able to get employment there. And in spite of not being able to speak English or hardly any, he then moved to Singapore later on, and so he was in areas that where English was the language, but somehow he never was able to grasp English at all. I'm not sure that I understand how that happened, but anyway, when France collapsed in 1940, Pierre Boulle joined what was called the Free French rather than the Vichy French. The Vichy French cut the deal with the Germans in 1940, and the Free French, General de Gaulle and all that sort of stuff. So Pierre Boulle joined the Free French and became, if you like, almost a secret agent or a courier type thing and was stationed in Singapore at that time. When Singapore was taken over by, or invaded by, the Japanese following the shameful British surrender there, Boulle was found out and was treated as a prisoner of war and sent to work on the railway, this thing. And so this is his experience as a prisoner building the railway, was part of the process of building the railway. This was the genesis of the novel, The Bridge on the River Kwai. Now, recently, I was ferreting through a secondhand bookshop, and I came across a copy, a well-used, well-thumbed copy of the Bridge on the River Kwai, which is quite a short novel, really, and written in the French by Pierre Boulle in the early 1950s. Now, I'm not sure why it became an international bestseller. It's a fairly short novel, I guess, so that's possibly got something to do with it. But it was translated from the French rather to the English. Doesn't come across, certainly to my reading anyway, doesn't come across as particularly exciting or insightful in any way. It's hard to, from a literary perspective anyway, it's hard to see why or how it could have become an international bestseller, but it did. Now, I suppose part of the reason was there was a lot of still discussion at the time, and war crimes type discussion about the brutality that the Japanese employed in not only building that railway, but against prisoners of war generally that they took. And the depiction of the heroic, morally superior British colonel and the juxtaposition of the morally inferior Japanese camp commandant, Colonel Saito. This was something that would have resonated, I think, with the British of the time, still humiliated by the crushing defeats they suffered at the hands of the Japanese armed forces during World War II. So I think this would have been a nice moral pill to say, see, we were morally superior all along. So I think it had that sort of traction. And again, David Lean, the very famous movie producer, director, did a movie on it called The Bridge on the River Kwai, which won a number of Academy Awards. And I remember watching the movie for the first time. It was made, I think, in the late 1950s. But I remember watching the movie for the first time, and they changed the story around quite a bit. But I remember watching it for the first time, thinking that there was some quite profound social commentary in. Now, as a young sort of as a child, the Japanese, a made in Japan sign, written on a product, made in Japan was considered to be a mark of inferior quality goods made by a backward people who lived on a bowl of rice a day and still ran around waving samurai swords and so on. And nothing could have been further from the truth, but nonetheless, that was the imagery that was created. And even as a kid, I sort of, as a young man, I asked me, well, or a teenager, how is it possible that such an inferior people could have made so many, defeated the Western, America and Britain and so on, France, could have defeated these armies so completely if they were so inferior? So even that question was in my head. But anyway, I read The Bridge on the River Kwai, the novel, again just recently, and wasn't particularly impressed by it. It wasn't terrible or anything, but an international bestseller, I couldn't see it. But throughout Pierre, and The Planet of the Apes included, throughout Pierre Boulle's novels, and this is something that doesn't seem to be discussed very much, he seems to explore this, well, it seems he does explore this thread of a superior people dominated by an inferior people or group, the apes being the inferior, dominating the superior humans. How could it happen? How could it possibly happen? And I didn't pick up on that when I was younger, and I had to look at a number of his, because he's written other novels as well, and you see that same thread going throughout the novels. Now, Pierre Boulle was again an engineer, so he could have looked at the railway and the bridge building that while he was a prisoner of war building that railway, and he could have seen the methods used by the Japanese. Now, I guess we need to look a little bit wider here. To the Japanese, being a camp commandant was that's not how you win glory and fame. You win glory and fame on the front line of the battlefield doing heroic stuff. Being a camp commandant of prisoners of war was maybe not shameful necessarily, but it was an inferior position. And those that were given those jobs, the officers were Japanese, but they weren't the pick. Those were the officers. Again, it was maybe shameful is too strong a word, but you definitely weren't on the top tier of the career promotions ladder if you were given a job as a camp commandant or as an officer in a camp. So it was an inferior role, and the guards, most of the guards, at the lower level, the officers, most of the guards at lower level were Koreans. Then Korea was a Japanese colony, or had been since the 1890s, and the Korean guards were chosen for their brutishness, and they certainly indulged themselves when it came to treating the prisoners of war, and also the local natives in Malaysia and Burma and so on. So Pierre Boulle would have been able to watch the low level engineering people. Some of these people, the assigned supposed engineers, the Japanese put on that. The frontline engineers were away on the battlefield, so the lower level engineers or maybe people who were apprentice engineers were given the job, and they weren't really up to it. And a qualified engineer like Pierre Boulle could have looked at that and thought, wow, these people are real amateurs. And something that came across in The Bridge on the River Kwai as he wrote about them. Now, Pierre Boulle was an interesting sort of guy. He never was able to form a lasting relationship with a woman in his whole life. The suggestion or the implication is that he flitted between homosexuality and bisexuality and so on. He had some platonic relationship with a married woman that didn't seem to really go anywhere, although they kept in touch over the time. So he's an interesting sort of guy in himself, and doesn't appear to have been able to make lasting friendships of any sort with anybody, which again seems a little bit strange. But anyway, he wrote these novels, and when he was in looking at or when he was working on the railways, he as a prisoner of war, he constantly refers to the Japanese as monkeys and baboons. He treats them very much as an inferior people, and inferior in methods, inferior in thought, inferior in morals, inferior in every way. They couldn't build a bridge to save their lives. Any engineering or technical undertaking, they fuck it up and so on. So he really looked down upon the Japanese in every way. Now, because he was like probably one of a handful of French guys, and or nearly all the people in his work crew were British. He uses this character of Colonel Nicholson, who's an invented character. It's an amalgam of various officers that he knew, French, British, and so on. But he uses that they have a superior morality and a superior standard of behaviour. They have better quality manners. They know how to sit at a table and use a knife and fork and so on. So he presents them as a morally superior. This is the British on the camp. A morally superior people being dominated and brutalized by a morally inferior people, and inferior in other ways, such as technical inferiority. And how can a group of people who are so superior be dominated by an inferior one? And again, this is the thread throughout the Pierre Boulle novels, and this creates then the wider question of who is superior, as in morally superior, and why and how. What are the signs? What are the definitions of all these things? How do we know that this group's inferior? And if one group can be morally and technically superior, how can they also be dominated by the inferior group? And this was something that Pierre Boulle couldn't get it straight in his mind. I would argue it was, in his view at least, maybe his perception of good and evil colliding and clashing. Maybe it was that, but he seemed to be unable. It was like a question in the novels. It was a question he was asking himself, and he simply used the environment in front of him he refashioned it or repurposed it to suit his good and evil together. But how can you tell the difference? Why is one superior or inferior, and so on? Now, in the Planet of the Apes, of course, you've got the situation where the monkey, or monkey planet, as Pierre Boulle called it, where the apes are in charge. The apes are the advanced society, and the humans are the apes. So there's just a complete reversal, in effect, of what's happening. But Pierre Boulle gives the apes a morality and gives the humans a lack of morality, but indicates they have the humans were once the superior race, but now they're not. The inferior race has now taken over, and they're displaying the same morality as 1950s and 60s humans did. Why is that? How can one dominate the other, and how do you define superiority or moral superiority or technical superiority? So the apes are given very 1950s, 60s type attitudes and views. They somehow have rifles, but they don't have motor vehicles or airplanes or any of the there appears to be no electricity, for example, in the ape cities. So how they have rifles is a little bit uncertain. But if you look at sort of rifle technology and then the technology that would have led to electricity, you'd see them happening at about the same time. Nonetheless, that's how it is depicted in the novels and the movies. So, and the apes all ride horses and so on. Now, how you would perceive, how anyone should perceive this difference, I think, is still a question today. The globalists, if we look, say, I'll digress a little bit, going and say the Soviet Union, when people were being arrested for political crimes, thought crimes. Now, this could be imagined. Maybe they hadn't really done anything. It was believed that they might be a counter-revolutionary or could be. They borrowed a book by Shakespeare from the library, and that was a trigger to having someone declared as an enemy of the people or a counter-revolutionary. They would put the political prisoners in not simply prison camps or work camps, but in camps of degradation. So they would pick these usually above average intellect people, and they would put them in these work camps, Siberia, the gulags as they were called, and they would purposefully pick brutal, low IQ guards to brutalize these high IQ people. That was a way of humiliating, maximum humiliation. It wasn't simply punishment to lock them up or get them to do heavy work or something like that. That there had to be absolute humiliation as well. So this is part of, as I would see it, at least part of what Pierre Boulle was coming at, is that if the superior people are dominated by the inferior people, that it comes with it an automatic sense or an automatic environment of humiliation for the superior people. And Colonel Nicholson in The Bridge on the River Kwai being an indication of the Charlton Heston character in Planet of the Apes. And so the morally superior people must not allow that humiliation to take place, and they can do so through exercising moral superiority. And over the longer term, they'll prevail, but they have to stay believing in their moral superiority and their superiority generally if they are to prevail. Now we move to the present day, where many would argue that the inferior people are being put into our parliaments by the globalists, the parliaments, the public service. They believe themselves to be morally superior because they've got a cultural studies degree or a lesbian dance degree or something like that, which makes them superior to the rest of us and gives them the right to morally lecture us and so on. But the other people, the hoi polloi, the plebeians are those cast as the plebeians are put in as the inferior. So the inferior ones are dominating the superior ones. We could argue that's happening today, and the globalists are purposefully selecting the brutishness, that people of their low IQ, and because they are brutish, to humiliate the rest of us. Is that a thread that's happening today? For example, I would argue that's certainly a possible observation to make. And it was something that I would equally suggest or imply that Pierre Boulle, in his novels, not just The Bridge on the River Kwai or The Planet of the Apes, but others as well, was exploring at the time. And it seems that question is yet to be answered, and that the mistakes and the unfortunate events of the past, we haven't learned from them, and they're beginning to repeat themselves right now in real time. It's been fantastic today, your pushback challenge. Thank you for listening.